Hello everyone, welcome to my continuing review of Mean Streets of Gadgetzan. Last week was Grimy Goons week as far as the cards we saw revealed. So we saw Paladin cards, we saw Warrior cards, we saw Hunter cards. And we've seen that kind of the theme of Grimy Goons is that they buff up minions in your hand. Some things other than minions too, which we'll get to in a bit. But primarily, they're buffing up things in your hand, and in some cases, keying off of those buffed cards. But let's just go ahead and jump right in with Paladin. Their hand buffing is done in a particular way, which is essentially buffing all of the cards in your hand, all of the minions in your hand. So let's just jump in and look at two of the cards at once, which are Grime Street Outfitter and Smuggler's Run. These cards really look like they're planning on fitting into the same deck because you get a lot of value out of buffing a lot of minions in your hand. So generally, I imagine that these are the sort of cards you'll want to play, perhaps with a bunch of card draw effects like Small Time Recruits, which we saw in the original reveal, and allow you to buff up a bunch of small things, which allows you to kind of flood the board and get just massively increased efficiency from those cards thanks to having them have +1, +2, plus even +3/+3. And we also see the Grime Street Enforcer, which is along the same lines as these, but this is a higher cost card, so I don't think really goes nearly as well in the, I'm just going to play a ton of one-cost minions, buff them all up, and overrun you with them. So Grime Street Enforcer, I think, is potentially a significant threat if you're able to keep it in play and protect it, but it's pretty hard to keep a 5-drop 4/4 in play for any substantial amount of time, whereas being able to just immediately play your Grime Street Outfitter, your Smuggler's Run, and just threaten to flood your opponent with a bunch of cheap minions. Like, imagine an Argent Squire that just gets buffed multiple times. You just get such efficiency out of that. You get such efficiency out of being able to get just way more stats per mana cost than you normally would, thanks to these buff effects on everything in your hand. So I imagine these are going to be played in very minion-heavy decks. These won't really be sort of typical, mix of minions and spells. They'll likely be like very, very high minions because you want to get as much value as you can out of these cards. But a bunch of cheap minions, these buff cards, and then ways to refill, redraw, and that seems like it has the recipe for potentially being a very powerful deck. So that's certainly one of the strategies I'm looking to explore from what I've seen so far, and we'll see what else there is that can fit into this kind of deck. Another card from Paladin that doesn't really fit into this style of deck, Grime Street Protector. It's a pretty interesting card because it is a 7-cost 6/6 taunt, which isn't great. Stat-wise, this is like okay. But the battle cry effect of giving adjacent minions Divine Shield is very powerful. It being an effect that doesn't come into play until turn 7, or when you have 7 mana. Usually turn 7, sometimes with a coin, or maybe you pretend to be a druid for a while. But this can enable you, in particular in like mid-range style mirror matches, to get like incredibly strong trades. I know that I was a huge fan of Cog Hammer when that was available in Standard, and in particular, that card was super strong when you were playing against an opponent who has similarly sized minions, because you could just generate a free trade from, say, your Paladin Shredder or whatever else onto their similarly sized thing, and then get just massive, massive tempo swing as a result. Grime Street Protector can give you multiple Divine Shields, doesn't require you to sort of trade away your board like Cog Hammer did, but doesn't come into play until much later in the game, so feels like it's going to have a much harder time having the same kind of tempo impact that Cog Hammer did. But in the right situation, if you are seeing lots of 6-7 cost minions staring at each other, which we don't really see in Standard these days, Grime Street Protector could be a very powerful card in that context. So moving along into Warrior. Warrior is interesting. It doesn't have quite the same direct theme we saw in Paladin of buffing all your guys. The cards that we see from Warrior are cards that A, have some sort of various buff effects in your hand, and B, can benefit from those buff effects. So let's start with one of the minions that's a good payoff for buffing up cards in your hand, which is Armorsmith. 2/7 taunt for 5 is not super impressive just in terms of raw stats. You'd expect to get a little bit more, I think, overall. But 7 health at 5 mana is generally going to mean your opponent has to attack through it multiple times. It is very, very vulnerable to things that just key off of its low attack, like, say, Shadow of Pain or even Cabal Shadow Priest. Really, really scary if you're playing with Armorsmith. But if you can buff up the Ally Armorsmith, it's super, super strong. You know, if you buff this twice somehow, it's basically the Priest's Nightmare. It's more or less build your own Twilight Drake with taunt that has, you know, tons and tons of health. And by the way, it has a very powerful ability. Whenever it deals damage, you gain that much armor. This, you know, you can generally expect, I think, this will at least get hit twice in most matchups in order for someone to punch through it, simply because 7 is so much health at that stage of the game. So this is kind of like, you know, a 2/7 taunt that gains you at least 4 armor. And that's a very, very powerful effect. And we haven't really seen the same quality of 5-drops in a lot of decks these days. You know, with Sludge Belcher gone, especially defensively oriented 5-drops, it's not really there's not really that many great options to play to the board and try and defend yourself. But Ally Armorsmith can do exactly that in a very, very powerful fashion. As to whether this is a card that will really find a home in Warrior shells that currently exist, I don't think so, simply because Control Warrior is really the premier Warrior deck these days. Not necessarily a place that they're looking for help. You're often using just card draw or direct removal effects, and we've seen some amount of, say, Bloodhoof Brave. That's kind of fallen out of favor as well in terms of defensive measures. But if the metagame gets particularly aggressive and you're looking for a very good tool to keep yourself alive and bridge to the later turns, Ally Armorsmith is definitely a great possible choice. So moving along, a great card to potentially buff Ally Armorsmith is Thorium Knuckles. This is a card that's a little bit weird because it's a 4-cost weapon, which kind of fills a hole that hasn't existed in Warrior for a while. You know, we haven't had Deathspite in the format since the standard rotation, but this isn't really a weapon that's primary use is removal. It's only a 2-attack weapon, which means it's going to have difficulty killing a lot of things on curve, but it does have a very powerful effect. Every time your hero attacks, you give a random minion in your hand +1/+1. Obviously works very well with something like an Ally Armorsmith, that you can buff it up and make it even more of a roadblock, even more of a threat. And it's worth noting that with Thorium Knuckles, by the time you potentially play your Ally Armorsmith, you'll have gotten 1 punch in the turn you play it, and the 2nd punch in on turn 5, and then there you go. You got your 4-attack Ally Armorsmith that is the nightmare of priests everywhere. So I'm already kind of having a little bit of jitters thinking about the possibility of that coming down against me playing priest, but we'll see. But you know, Thorium Knuckles definitely is a card that's difficult to evaluate without understanding the context of what else is going on in the set. I think that in a vacuum, you don't think of any decks you just put Thorium Knuckles in right now, but it's important to recognize that there are lots of things that are going to be good payoffs for these buff effects, like the Ally Armorsmith, and potentially more coming up in cards we have not yet seen revealed. So Thorium Knuckles, I think, is a card that's kind of floating under the radar for a lot of players right now. It looks inefficient as a weapon, but I think that the payoff of getting 3 +1/+1 triggers from your 3 strings with the Thorium Knuckles has the potential to be very, very powerful. We'll see as the set develops. Next, we have the Grime Street Pawnbroker. This is kind of a different take on the buffing effect of cards in hand, because this buffs weapons. This is, 3-cost 3/3, so a little under the curve in terms of what you want from raw stats from minions these days. But the battle cry effect is quite strong. Being able to give a weapon in your hand +1/+1 can be really, really powerful with a lot of weapons. Obviously, just giving, say, a Arcanite Reaper +1/+1, that represents a lot more damage, can punch through even Twilight Guardians, which very, very common minion that can otherwise brick wall a Arcanite Reaper. Even very powerful with Gore Howl. Gore Howl, great as a removal tool, but not so great at attacking face. Well, if you can give it +1 durability, getting 2 attacks in with Gore Howl is very nearly going to kill a lot of opponents at that stage of the game. So this can definitely be a card that fits into decks, obviously, with many of these sorts of weapons, and just gives you a lot of both potential damage output with something like Gore Howl, or just raw efficiency in terms of your ability to get value with a weapon. Not a huge difference with Gore Howl, but a huge difference with something like a Fiery War Axe, or maybe those Thorium Knuckles we were talking about. Being able to have a Thorium Knuckles hitting for an additional attack for additional buff, and having 3 attacks so it kills so many more minions is a very, very powerful effect. So this is a card that I think is maybe going to fly under the radar a bit, but there are enough interactions with Pawnbroker that I think it definitely has potential to see competitive play. Next up, we have Stolen Goods, a card that sort of bolsters the taunt theme in Warrior. See what I did there? We saw some more of this with I Know a Guy and such. This is a huge buff from an individual card, and the fact that it costs just 2 mana means you can play this early and then really buff up your early game taunts, like say Fierce Monkey or that Alley Armorsmith, and this can really increase the difficulty your opponents will have getting through your minions. So with this card, along with others, I think we may see sort of a shift toward decks and classes that have easy removal that isn't damage based. For instance, we may see Polymorph played more in mage decks simply because there will be sort of naturally more big minions around that you need to deal with. Because if so your opponent plays Stolen Goods, Alley Armorsmith, it's very difficult to get through that with damage just because it has so much health for its cost. So I do think this is a very interesting card, and we may see this, because it is such a powerful buff, potentially enable the taunt style warrior decks into something that we actually see in the metagame. So I'm looking forward to seeing if there are enough tools for that archetype, and if there are, this is definitely one of them. And last of the warrior cards we're going to look at today is Grimy Gadgeteer. This is kind of a unimpressive card in my mind. At the end of your turn, give a random minion in your hand +2/+2. Powerful effect, of course, if you're able to trigger this multiple times. But it's only a 4/3 body, so this is very difficult as a 4-drop to keep it into play for multiple turns. It trades down not only with minions, but gets killed by Fiery War Axe, gets killed by Frostbolt, gets killed by just a lot of things that will give your opponent pretty efficient trades on it. That said, it does open up the possibility for your future turns to be much more powerful, because giving a minion +2/+2 from this trigger can enable you to trade off the tempo that you're getting from your opponent trading up with their mana into your Gadgeteer, making it much more difficult for them to remove minions that you play on future turns. Say you play this, and then your next turn is Alley Armorsmith. It's like, okay, well, suddenly I have a 4/9 taunt that's going to give me armor every time it hits something. That's huge. And if you play this behind an Alley Armorsmith, and your opponent can only get through it with direct damage, can't actually attack into it, that can make your next Alley Armorsmith or your next whatever minion in your hand a lot more difficult for them to remove. So I think this card is unlikely to be particularly competitive, simply because the middle stage of the game are often very important in terms of tempo, and spending your turn 4 to invest in future turns is very different than spending one of your early turns, like say with the Paladin buff cards that we saw. And the investment that you get from this one isn't necessarily going to land on something that's going to have a huge impact. But I think that this is, an interesting card for sure. And if there are the right payoffs, things that care about getting that buff, then maybe it'll have a home in that kind of deck. But certainly not a card that I would imagine just sort of slots into any competitive decks that exist right now. All right, moving on to Hunter. There are a few cards that are kind of standard Grimy Goons looking cards in Hunter. The Trog Beast Rager. 3/2 for 2. Not a beast, despite being a beast rager. I guess he just rages at beasts. Maybe he's just mad he isn't a beast. A 3/2 with a positive effect. We've seen this kind of card, like the King's Elec, just be a reasonable option in Hunter. Of course, King's Elec being a beast matters quite a bit in a lot of circumstances, but this is a just totally non-tempo loss effect to give you a potential tempo advantage in the future. So this can be pretty key. Like, for instance, if your Trog Beast Rager effect buffs your Infested Wolf, or buffs something that you play that you're hoping to stick to perhaps land a Houndmaster on, that can be a very big deal. And Hunter can be a very, very tempo-oriented deck, and even getting a marginal advantage, which makes one of your middle turns difficult for your opponent to react to with one of their middle turns, can sort of snowball that lead into the point where you just need to hero power and eventually burn them down. So I think this card has some significant potential, and is very, very potent in the kind of gameplay that Hunter has, and I could easily see this slotting into existing decks. Next up, we have the Shaky Zip Gunner. This is another kind of basic card, a 3/3 for 3, so kind of basic stats there. With Death Rattle, give a random minion in your hand +2/+2. This is another pretty big boost. +2/+2 can really change the flashpoints on health and attack, where minions don't really just naturally trade in the middle of the game. And I think that this may be able to find a home in in decks that have cards that really care about getting buffed. Obviously, just naturally, a lot of minions can care about getting buffs on them just to make those trades more complicated. But it's even more powerful with cards that really do care about that buff, like, say, this one, Rat Pack. This card is great. This card, I think, is actually actively one of the most powerful cards that we've seen so far in the new expansion. Just as a 2/2 beast for 3 with Death Rattle, summon 2 rats, which I assume are beasts. I think that would be a pretty powerful card in Hunter, because it's something you can play on turn 3, which almost guarantees that you have a Houndmaster available target next turn. Obviously, Rat Pack, if your opponent does not remove it, is even more powerful with Houndmaster, because you can Houndmaster the Rat Pack, and now suddenly getting 4 rats when it dies. Also super strong. And works very well with any of the things that buff cards in your hand, like the Beast Rager, like the Zip Gunner. Buffing up your Rat Pack and suddenly having a 3/3 or 4/4 that makes 4 3 or 4 rats is super strong, and can really buy back the tempo that you may have lost from some of those earlier investments in buffing the minion in your hand. So this card, I think, is super strong, and it will definitely be something that finds a home in a lot of competitive Hunter decks. Another great payoff card we have is Dispatch Kodo. This is, just by itself, actually, I think a very powerful card. Kind of half the effect of old Keeper of the Grove, 2/4 that just deals 2 to something when comes into play. That can give sort of mid-range Hunter-style decks the ability to catch up against, say, Zoo or Tempo Mage, which can be somewhat difficult matchups for the mid-range versions of those decks, simply because you can easily fall behind on the board, and only playing one thing a turn, which is generally what mid-range doesn't give you the ability to catch up when you have fallen behind. Kodo does that, and it's also a beast, which means that it can enable your Houndmasters, enable your kill commands, and has a pretty high health to begin with. So it's hard for your opponent to clear and just prevent you from getting those triggers off. Also, obviously works very well with things that do buff it in your hand. If you're able to get Dispatch Kodo buffed up, you can potentially clear even bigger things, and that can be something that can cause really big swings when you get it activated. So this is a card that I expect will see a significant amount of play, and will be really interesting to see how much enabling it to be stronger than its base form, which I think is just good enough by itself, will really be an element of how this card finds a home in decks. Last for Hunters, but certainly not least, is Knuckles, who is pretty awesome. It is 3/7 for 5 as a beast, which is pretty compelling in terms of just giving you something solid that you can keep in the board. The 5-drop in Hunter has been something that's not really had a consensus card you want to play. We've seen some Tundra Rhinos, we've seen Stranglethorn Tigers, but in many cases, people will sometimes even forgo playing a 5-drop simply because there aren't particularly exciting options. Knuckles is pretty exciting to me. I don't know how good he is, because of the fact that he dies to Bookworm and Shattered Pain. Maybe I'm only thinking of the world in which people actually play Priest, but I think we're going to be in that world pretty soon with the cards that we've seen from Mean Streets of Gadgetzan so far. But Knuckles, it's pretty powerful. Allows you to clear off your opponent's minions while still damaging them. You don't need to even necessarily debate whether you trade or hit face, because Knuckles, he always hits face, and that's my kind of gorilla. Obviously works really well too with anything that buffs him, because it increases the ability he has to trade into opposing minions, as well as the damage he deals to your opponent in doing so. So definitely a tough to deal with card that can get a lot of value and damage in, and that's what a mid-range Hunter deck really wants. All right, and lastly, we have the neutral cards. Let's just quickly go through the ones that are not really worth saying too much about. Worgen Greaser, okay, 6/3 for 4. Ta-da, stats. Trades down, hits hard. Not much to really say about this. Don't think it'll see constructed play. Next up, we have the Backroom Bouncer for your Flesh-Eating Ghoul theme deck. This is reasonably interesting, perhaps in an arena perspective. Can grow out of control if you're able to get ahead and keep it in play, but don't think the stats on this one, the payoff, is good enough to find home in a constructed deck. Blow Gills Sniper. This is interesting because it is kind of an honest Murloc. We've seen most Murlocs these days as combo pieces in some sort of anything can happen style of deck. But this is a Murloc that actually allows you to play honestly toward the board, and possibly can help support a legitimate Murloc mid-range aggressive style of deck. I'd like to see Murlocs find a home as a faction or a tribe rather that's played as something other than just combo finishers, whether it's in Anything Can Happen deck or along with Shadow Step and such in Millrogue. Because Murlocs are cool, they're cute, like to see them around. But if they do see play, I think this is actually going to be a significant element of that, because having just a minion you can play has honest interactability is pretty important to that style of deck. One of the most interesting neutral cards that we've seen in this expansion is Dirty Rat. It's kind of reminiscent of Deathlord, but Deathlord is a card that you really only saw in decks that were good at protecting the Deathlord generally, or were playing lots of removal that didn't really matter that came off the Deathlord. Your Deathlord died, and it's like, okay, well now I can brawl you, things like that. And Deathlord also had the added bonus that many of those decks cared about fatigue, and actually pulling a card out of your opponent's deck could be very powerful in those circumstances. With Dirty Rat, you're not getting the extra card from their deck. And you're getting a powerful minion for sure, but you are often potentially setting yourself up to get really overrun. And also, it was tough to kill a Deathlord early on. Like you could play a Priest deck and have Powered Shield, have Velen's Chosen, and you could make it very difficult for your opponent to ever get the actual Death Rattle effect of the Deathlord. Whereas with Dirty Rat, you play it, your opponent hits, Ysera or Ragnaros or whatever, and you're in a lot of trouble. You don't have the ability to try and mitigate that drawback because you have buffs and healing. So I think this is a dangerous card. It's a very interesting card. It might be worth playing in the right metagame, but I'm very skeptical that this is going to be as potent as a lot of people seem to think. Another card that I'm very skeptical about, and will probably show up in a similar number of highlight reels to Dirty Rat, is Madame Goya. This is a card that Disguised Toast revealed, which is a very Disguised Toast kind of card, because it's basically just a meme card. This is a kind of card that is designed for YouTube highlights, and it's the sort of card that you play in a deck that has a bunch of gigantic minions and no small minions, and you just kind of say, all right, I'm going to get my Ysera for 6 mana, I'm going to get my Deathwing for 6 mana, or whatever else. I think that this is particularly powerful in a deck that has mostly things that aren't reliant on their battle cries. Obviously, Ysera, Chromagus, things like that. It's also worth noting, by the way, that its battle cry requires you to choose a friendly minion. So you have to actually have other minions. So you can't just play this and have your deck full of 8s and 9s and 10s and nothing else, because you have to swap the thing that you already have in play with the thing that you're triggering off. So it obviously can work very well in a deck that is using spells that generate minions. For instance, you have Living Roots and Force of Nature, and then nothing but gigantic minions and Madame Goya, and that can work. But it's going to be tough to get to that point enough that it feels like you're getting real value out of this card on a consistent basis. So, like I said, not a card that I really expect to see serious competitive play, but definitely a card that can be a lot of fun when it works and when it doesn't. So definitely a card that I'm looking forward to seeing. And last, but certainly not least, as this is Grimy Goons week, is the Head Don Honcho himself. This is a card that I've seen get a lot of kind of flack from the community, because they're saying, oh, this card isn't interesting, it's boring, yada, yada, yada. I think it's only appropriate that the leader of the Grimy Goons does the same sort of thing as many of the other cards of the Grimy Goons. It's kind of, this is showcasing design. Interesting. This is a design idea. This is going to the extreme of it. And this, I think, is actually just a very powerful battle cry. Obviously, at 7 mana, you're not getting huge tempo swings by buffing, something cheap and getting it down way ahead of time. You're only be able to play this on, turn 8 at least. But it's also worth noting that as you get later in the game, you're more likely to be able to sculpt your hand in such a way that you're guaranteed to get this battle cry to land on what you want. So if you are, say, playing Hunter, and you're like, okay, I've played out everything but my Dispatch Kodo, Honcho, now I have, a Kodo that I play and hits for 7 damage. And that's a pretty big deal. We haven't really seen all of the payoff cards, like the Dispatch Kodos, like the Alley Armorsmiths, things like that really care about having boosted stats. Don Honcho is obviously the most powerful thing you can do with those payoff cards in order to maximize the effectiveness you're getting out of them. So it'll be really interesting to see what all we end up having in the set that synergizes with Don Honcho, that synergizes with these buffs. And I'm sure that we'll see some cards that really, really get off the scales powerful if you are able to combine them with this buff. So I think this is a card that obviously won't just go into any deck, but in decks that are really caring about getting the buffs and payoff cards connected, I think Don Honcho is likely to see a significant amount of play. Whether those decks are competitive, hard to say without seeing the entire set, but I'm definitely looking forward to trying to make them work when we get Mean Streets of Gadgetzan in our hands. So anyway, that is it for this review. I'll be back soon with next batch of cards that comes through. So let me know what you think of my thoughts, and I'll see you next time.